Welcome back. I am genuinely so glad you are here with us today because we are embarking on a deep dive that is going to fundamentally challenge how we look at some very entrenched ideas.
It really is.
Yeah, if you are the kind of learner who lives for those massive paradigm-shifting aha moments, if you're someone who actually enjoys taking a sledgehammer to your own assumptions just to see what the foundation is really made of, then you are in the exact right place.
Absolutely. The stack of sources for today is incredibly dense.
Very dense.
Mm.
We are looking at materials that attempt to completely rewire how we view 2,000 years of history, theology, and, well, the biblical text itself.
It's a sweeping reconstruction.
Yeah.
The backdrop for today's deep dive is this really fascinating blend of ancient Hebrew texts, historical timelines, and surprisingly modern computer architecture.
Which is such a unique way to process ancient information, right?
Right. It gives us a completely different lens.
And let's be crystal clear about our mission right out of the gate. We are not here to host a religious debate. We are not here to tell you what to believe. We are here to conduct what the sources call a forensic audit of systemic data corruption.
A forensic audit. I love that term.
Exactly. We are looking at a highly detailed research framework designed by a researcher named Kenneth. This framework is called Covenantal Architecture. And the central claim of this architecture is incredibly bold. Kenneth argues that modern theology, as it is taught today, is currently operating on a broken source code.
And that is a massive claim to make. The framework asserts that creation was essentially the deployment of a highly specific system designed to produce a voluntary bride.
A voluntary bride.
Yes, and the argument Kenneth puts forward is that every major theological misstep, every contradiction that scholars have wrestled with for 2 millennia, stems directly from misunderstanding this original blueprint.
So the theory is that we've been looking at a map of a world that doesn't actually exist in the original data.
Right, rather than the world as it was actually architected.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we are going to look at the original design of creation itself, and then trace exactly how that original blueprint was supposedly corrupted by centuries of what the sources refer to as the college doctrine, we have a lot of ground to cover.
A ton of ground. We're going to explore everything from human volition to the original operating system of these texts.
And the specific historical figures who introduced what the framework calls runtime errors. And finally, the hardware upgrade that supposedly brings the whole system back online.
It is a structurally sound and logically sequential research architecture. Kenneth insists that if we get the starting point wrong, the entire trajectory of this analysis will just drift right back into the very college doctrine we are trying to audit.
So we really have to start at the absolute beginning.
We have to calibrate our understanding of the universe's root directory.
The root directory, I like that. The sources insist that this all starts with two massive competing concepts: foreknowledge versus coercion. The framework uses this specific analogy. It says the creator possesses absolute foreknowledge. The Greek word used in the text here is prognosis.
Prognosis, right? Meaning he sees the end from the very beginning.
Exactly. The sources quote Isaiah 46:10 to back this up, where it talks about declaring the end from the beginning. But, and then this is the crucial pivot the architecture makes, absolute foreknowledge. Foreknowledge does not equal coercion.
It absolutely does not.
It does not mean the creator uses deterministic force to control human will.
What's fascinating here is the relational logic behind this distinction. Why does it matter so much if God coerces human will or not? Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, if a creator forces a specific outcome in a human heart, then that creator is essentially just talking to themselves through puppets.
That makes total sense.
Imagine a programmer writing a script for a robot. The programmer types in a command that makes a robot say, "I love you." Those words have zero relational value.
Because it's just code executing a command.
Right. They are just echoing the programmer's own keystrokes. For a true other to exist, a people who can genuinely mirror character and participate in a relationship, there must be absolute uncoerced autonomy.
The capacity to choose against the creator must be entirely real.
Exactly.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. Think about how you and I were probably taught the story of the Garden of Eden growing up.
Right, the traditional narrative.
You usually hear it framed as this tragic accident. Humanity was placed in paradise, there was one rule, we broke it, and everything just fell
A
apart.
total failure of the system.
Yeah, but this framework suggests something completely different. It suggests that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil wasn't a trap. It wasn't a failure that caught the creator by surprise.
Not at all.
Kenneth's architecture argues that the tree of knowledge was a completely necessary feature of the system. It was the introduction of choice. But doesn't that mean the creator essentially set humanity up to fail?
Well, that is the exact tension the framework addresses. It argues that without the capacity for what the texts call the lust of the flesh meaning, without the actual tangible ability to choose something other than the Father, choosing the Father has no weight.
It means nothing.
Right. If Adam and Eve were biologically or systemically forced to obey, their righteousness would just be a mathematical certainty. It would be the robot saying, I love you.
Wow.
Love and loyalty cannot be coerced. They have to be selected from among alternatives.
Oh.
So in this view, the tree wasn't a bug in the code. It was the fundamental prerequisite for moving humanity from a state of untested, naive innocence into a state of mature, voluntary righteousness.
So because the creator has absolute foreknowledge, that prognosis, the fall of man, was a known variable. It was pre-calculated.
It had to be.
I love the analogy the sources use here of a master architect. If you are an architect and you're designing a massive suspension bridge, you know exactly where the stress points of the steel will be. You don't coerce the steel to bend.
That's just the nature of the material under pressure.
Exactly. But as a good architect, you design the bridge to account for the bending. You build the fault line logic into the foundation before you ever pour the concrete.
Precisely. And this forces a complete redefinition of a very heavy theological word that has caused endless debate. Predestination.
Oh, boy. Predestination.
Yeah. The Greek term used in the texts is peruju. Now, in the mainstream college doctrine, specifically within the Calvinist framework, which we will definitely touch on later, predestination is often viewed in a vacuum.
Right.
It's presented as this system where God arbitrarily pre-selects exactly who is going to be saved and who is going to be damned, completely apart from human choice.
Which goes back to the coercion thing.
Exactly. But in this covenantal architecture, predestination is not about who is saved. It is about the predetermined destination of the bride.
Let me make sure I'm tracking with this. You're saying the destination is what is predetermined, not the specific individuals who go on the journey.
Precisely. The destination is that the voluntary bride will ultimately be conformed to the image of the Son.
The spirit indwelt man.
Right. The architect designed the system so that the end result, a people who choose the rules of the house out of genuine love, is the guaranteed destination of the project. Whoever chooses to step onto that path and stay on it will reach that predetermined destination.
But the stepping onto the path is entirely voluntary.
Entirely.
That completely shifts the perspective. It moves away from the idea of a creator reacting in a panic to a disaster, to a creator masterfully executing a blueprint. He didn't create a perfect world, watch humanity break it, and then scramble for a plan B with the law of Moses.
And then later, a plan C with Jesus.
Right. In the now of the creator, the solution was already encoded into the foundation before the problem ever manifested in linear time.
Which brings us to the next logical step in this forensic audit. Because if the plan was set from the very beginning, and if the creator has absolute foreknowledge, then the instructions given to the people, what we call the law, cannot be viewed as a temporary patch or a failed experiment.
They have to be the core code.
Exactly.
And this introduces us to a massive component of the sources, the 13-point Scripture Master Charter. The framework outlines 13 foundational rules for interpreting the biblical data. And a massive one here is the source code priority.
Yes, the OS analogy.
Right. To explain this, Kenneth relies heavily on an operating system analogy. According to the data he presents, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Law of Moses, is the foundational operating system of the entire biblical text.
The mechanical logic here is actually quite brilliant when you break it down. If the Law of Moses is the operating system, then all the subsequent writings, the prophets, the apostles, the words of Yeshua himself, these are all applications.
Okay, apps running on an OS.
Right. And just like in basic computer science, an application must run on the underlying OS. If you try to install a Mac application on a Windows operating system, it fails.
It won't even open.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a biblical app tried to execute a command that violates the core logic of the foundational operating system, what happens? You get a system crash, a runtime error.
You get the theological blue screen of death. So the framework applies this operating system logic to another point on the Master Charter, the one law principle. It points specifically to Exodus 12:49, which states very clearly that there is one God, one people, and one law for both the native-born Israelite and the stranger who sojourns with them.
There are no separate legal tracks.
Right. There isn't one set of strict rules for the Jewish people and a different easier set of rules for the Gentiles.
This raises an important question about how we view the Gentile in the text. According to the architecture, a Gentile who comes into the faith is grafted into the existing commonwealth of Israel.
They are joining an already established nation.
With an already established constitution, they don't start a second tree. To suggest that the Creator has two completely different legal codes for two different groups of people introduces a massive systemic error.
Because it breaks the underlying logic.
It violates the very first point of the 13-point Master Charter, which is the law of non-contradiction.
Wait, let's pause and define that. The law of non-contradiction in this context means what exactly?
It means the Creator does not change his mind, his character, or his standards. If he established a perfect law, a perfect operating system, he doesn't scrap it 1,000 years later for a new group of people.
That makes sense.
If he says something is an everlasting statute in Leviticus, it cannot suddenly become a curse in the New Testament. If an interpretation of the New Testament contradicts the established facts of the Old Testament, the framework argues that the interpretation is flawed, not the original text.
Okay, but I have to ask the obvious question that I know anyone listening to this is thinking right now.
Go for it.
If the law is the operating system, and it never changes, how do we explain the entire New Testament, specifically the epistles of Paul?
Right, the elephant in the room.
Because if you walk into almost any modern church today, Paul's letters are routinely read as explicitly stating that the law is dead, abolished, or nailed to the cross. How does this architecture reconcile that massive contradiction?
The sources offer a really compelling perspective here, addressing another point on the Master Charter, the context of the missing half. Think about how you communicate today. Imagine you are reading a text message conversation on someone's phone, but you only have access to their side of the chat.
Oh, that would be confusing.
You are only reading half of the conversation. You see their replies, their rebuttals, their emotional reactions, but you have no idea what the other person originally said to trigger those responses.
It would be incredibly easy to misinterpret what was going on. If I just see a text that says, no, absolutely not, don't do that, I don't know if they're talking about eating a sandwich or robbing a bank.
Exactly. And the framework argues that this is exactly what the New Testament epistles are. They are reactionary fragments. They are patch updates.
Patch updates.
When Paul writes to the Galatians or the Corinthians, he is sending an emergency patch to a specific location to address a specific cultural crisis, a specific heresy, or a deviation from the oral tradition he had already taught them years prior.
So they weren't meant to be universal declarations.
The epistles were never intended to be read as a standalone replacement constitution. They are the rebuttal. But the initial argument, the cultural context that triggered the letter, is often lost to history.
So we essentially have scholars and theologians taking half of a two-way conversation, stripping it of its foundational Jewish context, and trying to build an entirely new religion out of it.
Yes.
If you delete the first 5 chapters of a mystery novel and try to reconstruct the entire plot based only on the final chapter, you are going to severely misidentify the protagonist, the conflict, and the resolution.
And that leads directly to a massive theological short circuit regarding the definition of sin. The 13-point charter leans heavily on 1 John 3:4, which explicitly defines sin as the transgression of the law. It says, sin is lawlessness.
It's a very clear definition.
This is simple, unassailable logic within the text itself. If the law is abolished, the definition of sin disappears.
Let me drill down on that. If there is no speed limit on the highway, you literally cannot get a speeding ticket. It's impossible. You can drive 150 miles an hour, and a cop can't pull you over because there is no law to transgress.
That is the exact legal reality. And if sin disappears because the law is gone, then the concept of grace becomes logically unnecessary.
Oh, wow.
You don't need a pardon to save you from a penalty that no longer exists on the books.
This is huge. The framework is pointing out that to claim the law is dead is to accidentally claim that grace is entirely pointless.
Right.
It completely shorts out the motherboard of the entire theological system. So if this one law was designed as an unchangeable operating system, the obvious question is, why does almost no one practice it that way today? Where did the code actually break?
Well, every system crash has a root cause. The framework identifies the architects of this data corruption, the historical figures who introduced these runtime errors into the operating system. It refers to them as the Three Great Skews.
The Three Great Skews.
And to understand how we got here, we have to trace the history of how the Hebraic text was filtered through Gentile philosophy.
Right, let's look at these historical skews. First up, we have a figure named Marcion. The sources call him the amputator. This takes us back to the 2nd century.
Marcion is pivotal because he represents the first major systemic breach in the dataset. He was operating in Rome around 140 AD. Now, you have to understand the cultural friction of the time. There was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment in the Roman Empire.
Very heavy anti-Jewish sentiment.
Marcion essentially looked at the Hebrew scriptures and decided he didn't like them. He was heavily influenced by Greek thought, which often viewed the material, physical world as inherently evil or flawed.
So he applies this Greek lens to the biblical text, and what does he do?
He fundamentally severs the text. He rejected the Old Testament God, claiming that the God of the Old Testament was a harsh physical God of wrath and law, while the God of the New Testament, the Father of Jesus, was a completely different, purely spiritual God of love and grace.
So he just splits them into two different entities.
He literally tried to amputate the roots of the faith from the tree. He threw out the entire Old Testament and only accepted heavily edited versions of Luke and Paul's letters.
Now, to be fair to history, the early church officially excommunicated Marcion as a heretic. They recognized what he was doing was wrong.
They did.
But Kenneth's formwork argues something much more insidious happened. Even though they rejected Marcion the man, his anti-Torah bias quietly infected the institutional mindset permanently. The seed was planted that the Old Testament was lesser or obsolete.
Exactly. The formal heresy was rejected, but the cultural posture was retained. And that set the stage for the second great skew, a couple centuries later, Augustine of Hippo.
The framework calls him the philosopher.
Yes.
I really want to dig into Augustine because his influence on modern theology is just staggering. Whether you're Catholic or Protestant, your theology has likely been shaped by Augustine. The sources argue that Augustine introduced Neoplatonic philosophy directly into the interpretation of the text.
Yes. Augustine came from a background involving Manichaeism and Neoplatonism before his conversion. These philosophies heavily emphasize the absolute sovereignty of the divine and the utter depravity of the material world.
So he brings that baggage with him.
When Augustine started interpreting the biblical texts, he brought these philosophical lenses with him. He introduced the concept of coerced knowledge and really codified the framework of original sin.
Let's break down original sin in this specific context, because most people think they know what that means, but how does the framework view Augustine's version of it?
Augustine formulated the idea that humanity is not just born into a fallen world, but is born so entirely corrupted that human beings completely lack the free will to choose God on their own.
Total depravity.
Right. In his view, you are biologically incapable of choosing the good. Therefore, God must independently and coercively inject grace into certain individuals to save them, while leaving others to their natural damnation.
And there it is. That completely violates the root directory we talked about earlier. It removes the necessity of human choice.
It does.
By shifting the focus to a divine decree that happens completely outside of the individual's volition, Augustine turns the creator back into that programmer who hard-codes the saved and the damned.
He bypasses the relational mechanics of the covenant entirely.
It takes the voluntary out of the voluntary bride.
It's a critical philosophical pivot. And it paved the way for the third great skew during the Protestant Reformation. We hit the ultimate systematizer, John Calvin.
Right, Calvin.
Calvin essentially took Augustine's logic to its absolute extreme conclusion.
Calvinism is a massive theological system today. How does covenantal architecture audit Calvin's contribution?
Calvin formalized the ideas of irresistible grace and absolute deterministic predestination. In his institutes, he codified a system where every single human action, every salvation, and every damnation is meticulously prescripted by God's sovereign will.
A programmed script.
Exactly. He took the dynamic, choice-driven marriage covenant that we see in the Torah and turned it into a cold, pre-programmed script.
And according to the Master Charter, if salvation is strictly coerced, it creates a massive logical conflict. A covenant, a marriage, by definition, requires a choice between two distinct parties.
It has to be mutual.
If God coerces the response, the covenant isn't a marriage. It means the command we see all over Deuteronomy to choose life so that you and your descendants may live is just a cosmic taunt. Why tell someone to choose if the choice was already made for them before they were born?
This is what the sources refer to as the college doctrine. The combination of Marcion's anti-Torah bias, Augustine's Neoplatonism, and Calvin's determinism created an academic silo. Modern theology became an institutional filter.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means that when many scholars or pastors operate within this college doctrine, they are essentially reading the Bible backward.
Very true.
They start with the predetermined, historically skewed conclusion that the law of Moses is dead and replaced. Then they use the missing half of Paul's letters, those reactionary text messages, to justify that conclusion.
They are actively trying to run Gentile Greek philosophy on a Hebraic Israelite operating system.
The result is a distorted reality where the Creator's law is viewed as a curse rather than a constitutional foundation.
And this creates a massive narrative problem. Because if the law is actually still valid and humanity has broken it, how does the Creator fix the problem without breaking his own rules?
Which perfectly sets up the next phase of our forensic audit, where we have to look at the actual legal mechanics of redemption.
Let's do it.
This is where the research gets incredibly intense. We are moving into the legal paradox and the blueprint of the kin redeemer. To understand this, we have to look at Romans chapter 7 and what the sources call the divorce decree. I want to slow down here because this is forensic theology at its finest, and it requires connecting some very specific dots between the Old and New Testaments.
Let's lay out the legal reality according to the prophets, specifically Jeremiah 3:8.
Okay, Jeremiah 3:8.
The text states that the house of Israel committed spiritual adultery by going after other gods and adopting the practices of the surrounding nations. Consequently, God, acting as a righteous judge and husband, issued Israel a certificate of divorce and scattered them into the nations. They were exiled.
Okay, so that is the historical setup. But now we have to look at the actual law in Deuteronomy regarding marriage and divorce. If a woman is divorced by her husband and she goes and becomes another man's wife, or in this metaphor, worships other gods, what exactly does the text say happens?
The Torah is very clear on this. Deuteronomy 24 states that if a divorced woman is defiled by another, her first husband cannot legally take her back as his wife. It is an abomination before the Lord.
And right there is the massive legal paradox. God wants his people back. He loves them, but he cannot break his own law to get them.
He's bound by his own word.
If he just ignores the rule in Deuteronomy, takes Israel back, and sweeps the idolatry under the rug, he violates the law of non-contradiction, he ceases to be a just judge, he corrupts his own operating system. So, from a purely legal standpoint, how does he close the loop?
The loophole is death. Romans 7 opens by explaining a fundamental legal principle. The law of marriage is only binding over a person as long as they live. If a husband dies, the wife is legally released from the marriage contract. She is free to marry another.
Okay, I follow that.
The framework points out that the only way to legally dissolve the first marriage contract, the one broken by Israel's adultery without violating the Torah, is the death of the husband.
Wait, the death of the husband?
Yes, the death of the Messiah legally severs the penalty of that first breached contract. When Paul writes in Romans 7, you also have become dead to the law by the body of Christ, he isn't saying the law of Moses is dead.
The operating system didn't die?
He is saying the specific criminal record, the breached marriage contract that kept the house of Israel in legal exile, is dead. The penalty has been absorbed.
This brings up a wildly controversial point in the sources regarding the nature of the Messiah. Kenneth's architecture makes a highly provocative claim here. It argues that for this specific legal transaction to work for the death to legally count to release the bride, the Messiah must be a biological human being.
He has to be.
He must be of the literal seed of David according to the flesh, as Paul states in Romans 1:3.
The framework points to the biblical concept of the Goel, which translates to the kin redeemer. We see this heavily in the book of Ruth. The law of the kinsman requires that the redeemer must be of the exact same bloodline. They must be kin.
It's a strict legal requirement.
Right. A pre-existent eternal deity merely wearing a human meat suit cannot legally redeem biological humans under the law, because a divine being is not a biological kinsman to a human. This architecture directly challenges the traditional post-Nicene Trinity construct.
That is going to ruffle a lot of feathers.
It definitely will.
But let's follow the logic of the framework. If the Messiah isn't a pre-existent second person of a Trinity who became a man, then who or what is he according to this source code?
The sources assert an indwelling logic. They argue that the Word, the logos mentioned in John 1, was the blueprint. It was the plan, the foreknowledge in the mind of the Father.
Okay.
Yeshua the man was the manifestation of that blueprint. God did not become a man. The Father indwelt a biological man via his Spirit.
Think of it like the difference between an architect's blueprint and the physical building itself. The blueprint pre-exists the skyscraper. It is the building in terms of data, dimensions, and information.
But you can't walk into the blueprint.
Exactly. It isn't the physical steel and glass. The word, the logos, was the data, the foreknowledge. When that perfect data was compiled into human DNA at a specific point in linear time, it became the man.
Exactly. Yeshua is the precise physical map of what happens when the original word, the Torah, is perfectly executed by a human mind that is entirely powered by the Father's Spirit.
The prototype.
He is the prototype of the Spirit-indwelt man. He did not come to replace the law. He came to demonstrate how a human actually runs the operating system perfectly.
And this reframes the event of the cross entirely. We really have to tackle a famous smoking gun verse that the college doctrine uses all the time to claim the law was abolished. Colossians chapter 2.
Oh, this is a big one.
The verse talks about the handwriting of ordinances being nailed to the cross. I've heard pastors preach countless times that this means the law of Moses was nailed to the cross and destroyed.
But the framework provides a crucial historical and linguistic correction here. The Greek word used by Paul in Colossians 2 is chirographan. In the first century Roman world, a chirographan was not a constitution. It was not a book of national laws.
What was it then?
It was a ledger of debt. It was quite literally a criminal charge sheet or an IOU signed by a debtor.
Let's use an everyday analogy to make this crystal clear. Think about getting a speeding ticket. If you rack up a massive stack of unpaid speeding tickets, and a merciful judge looks at your record, decides to pardon you, and physically shreds those tickets. Wait, no, I mean, he shreds the tickets. He hasn't abolished the speed limit.
Right.
He hasn't made it legally permissible to drive 100 miles an hour down residential streets. He just removed the evidence of your personal guilt.
That is a perfect parallel. According to this forensic audit, the cross didn't kill the law of Moses. It killed your criminal record. It nailed your specific ledger of debt, your chirographan, to the cross, freeing you from the legal penalty of your past transgressions so you can finally go out and obey the actual law properly.
Which is the perfect organic transition into what the framework calls the hardware upgrade and the new meaning recovery. If the law isn't dead, if the speed limit is still firmly in place, then what exactly is the new covenant that the New Testament talks about so much?
To understand this, the sources dive into the original Hebrew word used by the prophet Jeremiah when he foretold the new covenant in Jeremiah 31. The word is chadash.
Chadash.
And it does not mean brand new out of nothing. It functions much like the cycle of the moon. When we talk about a new moon, we don't mean a completely different physical rock has appeared in the sky. We mean a renewal, a restoration of light to the existing original body. It is more accurately translated as a renewed covenant.
And the framework points out that this holds true even in the Greek text of the New Testament. There are two distinct Greek words for new. There is neos, which means new in time, something brand new that never existed before.
Right.
And there's kainos, which means renewed, refreshed, or new in quality. The New Testament authors overwhelmingly use kainos when talking about the covenant.
Because the Creator isn't a fickle architect who pours a massive foundation, decides he hates it, tears it up, and pours a completely different one 2,000 years later.
That would violate the law of non-contradiction again.
Exactly. The data, the law, the operating system stays exactly the same. What changes in the renewed covenant is the delivery system. The prophecy in Jeremiah says, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts. It moves from external stone tablets to internal heart writing.
I love the tech analogy the sources use to explain this dynamic. Think of the law of Moses as a high-end, perfectly coded software program. It is, as Paul himself says in Romans 7:12, holy, just, and good. The problem was never the software.
It was the hardware.
The problem was that human flesh was a faulty processor. The biological hardware of ancient Israel simply couldn't run the high-end software without constantly crashing into idolatry. So the Spirit, the indwelling presence of the Father, is the processor upgrade.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it exposes the massive logical fallacy of modern theology. If you upgrade a computer's hardware, say you install more RAM and a faster processor specifically so it can finally run a highly demanding program, you don't then turn around and delete the program.
That would be absurd.
God didn't delete the law because the old fleshly hardware couldn't run it. He gave humanity the Spirit so they could finally execute the program properly. The first century disciples weren't learning a law-free life. They were learning a law-filled life, but one powered by a completely new source.
And that new power source changes the entire motivation of the believer. It changes the dynamic from duty to desire. Trying to obey the law without the Spirit is just exhausting legalism. It's like revving a car engine while you're in neutral.
You make a lot of noise, but go nowhere.
You generate a lot of heat, you might even look impressive to bystanders, but you have absolutely zero forward momentum. You are just grinding the gears of your own willpower.
But when you add the proper fuel to an engine that is actually in gear, everything changes. And what is the fuel in this architecture? 1 John 5:3 spells it out explicitly. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome.
Love is the fuel that runs the engine of the law.
Exactly. The sources refer to the law as a burden theology, as a virus. It's a complete corruption of the original data. If you really think about it, the law is just the house rules of a loving father.
Let's use the Sabbath as an example.
Sure. If you view the law through the lens of the college doctrine as a curse or a heavy burden, you might keep the Sabbath because you're terrified of getting hit by a lightning bolt, or you just resent it entirely.
The old meaning, filtered through the flesh, was, I have to do this because it's the law and I don't want to be punished.
But the new meaning, the kainos meaning that the apostles were actually teaching, is, I want to do this because I love him. If you have the hardware upgrade, you keep the Sabbath because it's a weekly designated date with the Creator.
You want to be there.
It's the exact same law, the exact same day, but the power source has shifted from external coercion to internal devotion. In this paradigm, the Father is finally getting the voluntary bride. He architected the universe to produce.
Which brings us to the final, and frankly, perhaps the most sobering section of this deep dive. We have to look at the Reformation, the modern crisis, and what the framework calls the final divorce.
This is where history hits the present day.
We look back at the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin, all the big historical names. They famously protested the abuses of the Catholic Church. But according to this forensic audit, they failed to fix the core runtime error.
They protested the institution, they fought against indulgences and papal authority, but they kept the source code corruption. They kept replacement theology, the idea that the Gentile church completely replaced Israel in God's plan, and they retained the underlying philosophy that the law of Moses is a burden that has been done away with.
They essentially just swapped out a Catholic college doctrine for a Protestant college doctrine.
And the sources argue this specific failure led directly to the great falling away that is predicted in the New Testament texts. It led to the rise of what is termed the lawless party.
The Greek word used in the biblical warnings is anomia, right?
Yes, anomia, which literally translates to Torahlessness, or being without the law. Over centuries, the beautiful concept of grace was tragically redefined. It went from meaning the divine power given to obey the law to essentially meaning divine permission to disobey the law.
This is where the framework introduces a massive paradigm-shifting revelation about the narrative purpose of the entire New Testament. Think about the Gentile mission that the Apostle Paul was on.
The college doctrine teaches that Paul was out starting a brand new Gentile-centric religion.
But Kenneth's architecture argues that it was actually a global search and rescue operation.
Let's tie this back to the divorce decree we talked about earlier. The house of Israel had been divorced and scattered into the surrounding nations centuries before Jesus was born. They intermarried, they assimilated into pagan cultures, they completely lost their historical identity.
To an outside observer in the first century, they just look like everyday Gentiles.
Yes. The argument here is that the Great Commission was primarily about gathering the lost sheep of the house of Israel, whose DNA and heritage had been swallowed up by the world. It was a legal homecoming for the exiles.
Yeshua literally said in Matthew 15, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Modern theology often just glosses right over that verse or spiritualizes it.
But if you realize the primary target audience is the assimilated, exiled house of Israel, then the law isn't some foreign Jewish burden being forced on Greek outsiders. It is their own ancestral constitution.
This is their heritage.
The epistles aren't creating a new religion. They are the specific instructions on how these lost sheep can legally return to the Father's house under the renewed covenant.
But that raises a terrifying question. What happens if they refuse the house rules? What happens if they're presented with the opportunity to return, but they prefer the lawlessness of the nations?
The architecture connects this to a chilling parallel in Romans chapter 1. Paul talks extensively about what happens when people worship the creature rather than the creator.
The sources apply this directly to modern theology. When believers worship the man-made creature of the college doctrine, clinging to constructs like the Trinity or the lawless grace theory, rather than submitting to the lawgiver himself, God gives them up.
It is the exact legal language of a judicial divorce. Paul says it 3 separate times in Romans 1. God gave them up. If the bride insists on pursuing other lovers, in this case, the comfortable idols of man-made, burden-free theology, and repeatedly rejects the husband's actual law, the husband eventually honors her choice.
He stops enforcing the rules. He lets her experience the full, devastating reality of life without his presence.
It perfectly aligns with the root directory we started with, foreknowledge without coercion. If you absolutely refuse to live in the husband's house by his rules, he will not coerce you. He honors your choice. He gives you exactly what you want, a lawless reality.
The framework suggests that this is the second great sifting. The first sifting was the historical scattering of Israel into the nations to test their hearts. The second sifting is happening right now.
The map Yeshua has been provided. The renewed covenant, the hardware upgrade of the Spirit is available.
But if people look at the clear source code of the text and say, no, I prefer my lawless college doctrine, they are voluntarily choosing exile once again.
Wow. If you're listening to this, I know this is a tremendous amount of heavy, paradigm-challenging information to process. Let's try to summarize this massive architecture we've just audited.
A lot to take in.
We've traced the data corruption all the way back to its source in the 2nd century with Marcion through Augustine and Calvin. We've audited the operating system, finding that the Torah is the foundational code.
The New Testament is not a new religion. It is a maintenance manual for the Old Testament.
The epistles are reactionary patch updates showing the scattered house of Israel how to return. Yeshua is the prototype, the precise map, showing us how to finally live the one law, not by the grinding weakness of the flesh, but by the power of the Spirit. Love is the fuel for the engine of the law.
The theological map we've been handed by centuries of institutional history describes a world that simply doesn't exist in the original source code. The Creator has never changed his mind. He hasn't broken the law of non-contradiction.
According to this framework, he has spent thousands of years executing a brilliant, pre-calculated architectural plan to secure a family who voluntarily chooses his ways out of genuine love.
It proves that the original design of the garden, the introduction of choice, was a success all along.
It changes everything about how you read the text. But before we wrap up, our expert is going to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought, something to really mull over as you digest all of this on your own.
If the entire story of creation is a father looking for a family who voluntarily chooses him and his law, and if rejecting that law results in a judicial final divorce, it raises a vital question about the end times. The Apostle Paul speaks in 2 Thessalonians 2 of a strong delusion sent by God so that people will believe a lie. Could that strong delusion simply be God giving modern believers completely over to the very lawless, burden-free theology they so desperately want? Could the impending tribulation be nothing more than the ultimate, final sifting process, designed solely to separate those who genuinely love the Creator's law from those who are in love with the creature's system?
That is a question that demands an answer, and it's one you'll have to explore for yourself. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. We know it was intense. Keep questioning, keep digging past the historical translation layers, and most importantly, check the source code of your own beliefs. We will see you next time.